Hello, and welcome to Lecture 1, Part 1 on Chapter 1 of the textbook. So, this chapter begins by asking the question, what is philosophy? And it gives a pretty broad initial answer. Philosophy is a critical approach to all subjects. The comprehensive vision within all other subjects are contained. So, it sort of makes sense that you can have philosophy of anything. There's philosophy of science, philosophy of business, um, political philosophy. Philosophy bleeds into all other fields of knowledge, and we'll get to this in a minute, but all other fields of knowledge were considered branches of philosophy initially. It was like the field of knowledge. It's also defined as a discipline that teaches how to articulate, hold, and defend beliefs as well as to question them. So that's sort of expanding on, in the first definition, this idea that it's a critical approach. It's a discipline that is sort of inherently critical. According to Bertrand Russell, philosophy is studied for the sake of the questions, not the answers. So some of the major questions that philosophers have dealt with over the centuries have never been resolved. What is the meaning of life? What is the nature of humanity? Like so on and so forth. There aren't like definitive answers to these questions. But in the process of asking them and thinking critically about them, different worldviews and approaches to viewing the world have been offered. Another way of defining philosophy is etymologically, and etymologically means looking at the roots, the Greek and Latin typically roots of words, and trying to come up with a definition based on that. And philosophy breaks down into two main roots, philia, which means love, and sophia, which means wisdom. So etymologically, philosophy sort of literally means love of wisdom, but how do you define wisdom? So as I mentioned earlier, all other fields of knowledge sort of started out as branches of philosophy, like philosophy sort of in the medieval period and prior was sort of just knowledge. So there's sort of remnants of that today, of a sort of medieval classification of knowledge, because even today, if you get a doctorate degree in a lot of different branches of knowledge, it's considered a PhD, and the PH in PhD stands for philosophy. So some other ways, more practical ways of defining philosophy and sort of looking at the history of philosophy and trying to figure out what philosophy is that a lot of it is sorting definitions. And another way of defining it is thinking of it as primarily concerned with morality and religious claims, and trying to figure out the answer to the question, what constitutes the good life or a good life? Some basic terms include the word assumptions, and assumptions are beliefs that are held without thought, evidence, or good reasons. So all of us have a lot of assumptions about the world that control how we view the world, and philosophy is helping us interrogate those assumptions. Presuppositions are what is assumed or supposed beforehand, taken for granted in advance. So they're basically assumptions that you carry into a conversation or an argument. Critical thinking means to examine carefully and cautiously, being willing, if necessary, to change one's own beliefs. So if you're just defensive, if you engage in arguments but aren't actually willing to question your own beliefs or assumptions, then you're just being defensive. You're not actually engaging in critical thought. And an argument is an attempt to justify our beliefs, to back them up with good reasons. So, three of the most famous philosophers in the West are ancient Greek philosophers, and I put them sort of in the order that they lived. So Socrates came first, and Socrates never actually wrote anything down. He sort of just walked around Athens, questioning people and just demonstrating to people that they don't know as much as they think that they know. And he sort of, you can sum up Socrates' philosophy by saying that the wise person is one that knows that she knows nothing. So he was sort of just destabilizing what other people knew. And his protege or student was Plato. And Plato wrote wrote these dialogues, the Socratic dialogues, where Socrates is a character in the dialogues, interrogating someone and proving that they know nothing. So we know a lot about Socrates. We know a lot about what he did and his methods. The Socratic method is just the method of just asking questions and drawing out answers from someone based on just asking questions instead of telling them things. And we know about Socrates through Plato. Plato also wrote a lot of his own philosophy. And then Plato's student was Aristotle. Aristotle is going to be really important when we talk about medieval philosophy. He was such, in medieval European philosophy, you just have a blending of Christian thought and Aristotelian philosophy, so much so that during the medieval period in Europe, Aristotle was just known as the philosopher. That's how important he was. It was sort of just Christian thought during the medieval period was just like reheating and blending Aristotle with Christianity. But it's important to know that philosophy does not begin in ancient Greece. The oldest philosophical texts are the Indian texts known as the Vedas, which are the sort of the foundation for Hinduism and Hindu thought. And they were compiled 1,000 years before Socrates. And also another example would be Confucianism and Taoism in China. And of course, globally, all over the world, people ask the question, what is the nature of reality? What is the meaning of life? What is a good life? Like, those are not questions that arise only within Hellenic and later European contexts. But when we think about philosophy today and in the United States, we usually focus on like Western philosophy, and Western philosophy has its beginnings in ancient Greece. And of course, a lot of the world does view the history of philosophy through a European lens because of European imperialism. So the book talks about the axial period, which is explained by Karl Jaspers. And this is just basically that there was a time period around, the heart of it was around 500 before the Common Era. But it was basically a spiritual process that began between 800 and 200 BCE, where in different parts of Eurasia, you have this explosion of philosophical and religious thought. So during this time period, you have Confucius, you have Lao Tzu, from Taoism, you have the Upanishads, which are Buddhist texts. The textbook dates Zarathustra from Zoroastrian thought around this time, but Zarathustra might have existed much earlier, 1,000 years earlier, around 1500 before the Common Era. It's very difficult to date this prophet. And Zarathustra developed the first monotheistic faith, or the first faith that believed in one God. He was like the Persian prophet. He also was the first person to come up with the idea of the afterlife being divided into heaven and hell, and you are punished or rewarded for your life in the afterlife. He also believed in bodily resurrection and apocalypse at the end of time. So all these ideas come from a Persian religion that predates Christianity between 500 and 1,500 years. You also have at this time the great Hebrew prophets like Elijah and Isaiah, and this is also where you can date Plato and therefore Socrates and Aristotle as well. So sort of this coincidental or not, whatever, explosion of human thought, philosophical and religious thought during the axial period. East versus West. So since we're going to use a sort of a Western approach, but sort of pepper that with Eastern philosophy in this class, it's important to understand some major differences between Eastern thought and Western thought. These are vast generalizations, but they are helpful to engage in nonetheless. So one is that in Eastern thought, Hinduism, Taoism, Buddhism, all these traditions think of reality as ultimately one, that there's one substance that exists or one non-substance that exists, and we all participate in this one ultimate reality. And that's known as monism. It comes from the root mono, meaning one, so like one-ism. So in Taoism, for example, all that exists is this force called Qi, which is sometimes spelled Chii, or Qi. If it's Qi, it's still pronounced Qi. And it's still pronounced Tao if you see it spelled with a T. Sometimes it's spelled Tao, and it's still pronounced Tao. So it's just sort of a confusing. There are two systems for transliterating Chinese pictographs and characters into English, the English alphabet. And Qi is composed of two essences, yin and yang. It's not yin and yang, it's yin and yang. And this isn't good and evil. It's wrong to think of yin and yang as good and evil. That's absolutely not the case. They're just two, they are gendered, but they're just two different forces, an active and more passive force in the universe. And the interplay between yin and yang, of which Qi is composed, the creative rhythm of yin and yang, is known as the Tao. And the whole point of Taoism is to, through actionless action or wu wei, to live in harmony with the Tao. And everything that exists is just the rhythm of the Tao. And in Hindu thought, basically everything is Brahman. That there are 330 million gods and goddesses within Hinduism, but all of them are manifestations or expressions of one ultimate reality known as Brahman. And you are ultimately an expression of Brahman. So everything is God, basically, within Hindu thought. And there's no separation between God and creation. And in Western thought, it's very different. Western thought's been dominated by the Abrahamic faiths, which we'll define in the next chapter, and the idea of monotheism, the idea that there's one ultimate God that is absolutely separate from creation and transcendent and outside of creation, but interacts with creation. Another major difference between Eastern and Western thought is that in the West you have the logos, or the rational order of the universe, and eternal truth, and this really static understanding of reality, really fixed understanding of reality, and a fixation on immortality and that which doesn't change, which is immutable. Versus in the East, everything is sort of seen as flux, and there's an emphasis on being part of the flow of a universe that's constantly amidst change, movement, and process. I should say, however, that the book's right in pointing to this major difference, but it's really Plato that is responsible for this fixation on eternal truth, rationality, and a more static understanding of reality, because Plato believed in Platonic forms, or like essences that are these fixed, more real forms of reality than sort of what we experience in the world, and that they're transcendent. And but before Plato, there were philosophers in ancient Greece like Heraclitus and Parmenides, who had more Eastern ways of viewing the world as, flux and as in process. But on the whole, post-Plato, the West is fixed on a more static, eternal, immutable understanding of truth and reality, and the East is more focused on process, change, and movement. Another feature of Western thought is that in Western thought, we sort of fixate on what's called binaries, where you divide things sort of black and white thinking, and it's either one or the other. So an example would be good versus evil, sacred versus secular, masculine versus feminine, transcendent or outside of reality, that which is spiritual versus the material world. And sometimes these binaries overlap. So for example, transcendent or spiritual and material are often gendered, where the transcendent and spiritual are masculine and the material is feminine. And you can even see this in the root of the word material etymologically is the Latin root mater, which means mother. So the root for material, matter, and maternal is all mother. And that's why you see in the West, nature is personified as feminine, and God is often referred to in exclusively male language. So black and white thinking and sort of dichotomies and binaries that are often gendered is a common idea in Western thought. So this textbook says that it's using a modern approach to philosophy, specifically a modern Western approach. And this approach has its origins in the rise of science and technology. The European Enlightenment is the historical moment where this approach comes about, which takes place in the late 17th century through the French Revolution, which takes place in 1789. And part of this approach is that the world is understandable and every event explainable. This is often called naturalism. Naturalism often does involve the denial of a supernatural, and sometimes it's called scientific naturalism. So for example, like in a laboratory, if something happens, we don't even consider the possibility that it was a ghost or that it was a god that is responsible for what happened, but we believe that there's a natural explanation using universal natural laws for explaining what happened. So that bleeds into the next point, that the universe is rational, operating by universal laws. And of course, Isaac Newton really helped us mathematically understand many of those laws, including gravity. And another feature that's sort of separate from this scientific natural worldview is individualism and a value for thinking for yourself and the autonomy or self-rule of the individual person. René Descartes is often considered the father of modern philosophy, and it's important to note that looking at the history of philosophy through like a Western European lens, it's mostly white men, like because it's a European lens, and these were historically a civilization that was intensely patriarchal or male dominated, so women did not have the access to an education to be philosophers or taken seriously as philosophers on the whole for much of European history. So we have the father, it's a father of modern philosophy. So if you study philosophy in the United States, you're going to encounter Western philosophy, and it's pretty much dead white guys is most of what you're going to be studying, with exceptions. So René Descartes is known for having a revolutionary method for figuring out his worldview and trying to resolve what are truth claims that we can absolutely make. And so it's called hyperbolic doubt. So radical doubt, doubting everything except for that which you can be certain of. But even though he got in trouble with the church for having this revolutionary method, and his results for applying hyperbolic doubt were really conservative and show that he's really a product of his time. So he uses hyperbolic doubt to start with the most basic truth that he can come up with, and that is, I think, therefore I am, that I exist. But from there, he radically is able to jump to God exists and all these other really conservative, historically typical results. But at least like his method was really revolutionary, and questioning everything and thinking for yourself sort of expresses modern philosophic ideology. So 2 other concepts that the book draws our attention to are skepticism, and the skeptics were a school of ancient Greek intellectuals that doubted everything. So skepticism is when the philosopher finds himself or herself unable to justify what every sane person knows to be the case. So sort of radical doubt, it begins with doubt. And an example is solipsism. And solipsism is the belief that only your own mind exists. So you can't experience other people's minds. You only experience your own mind. So how do you know other people's minds exist? They're not just zombies or part of this one dream that your mind is having. And there's no way to disprove solipsism. There's no perfect logical proof. There's no perfect argument other than, Bertrand Russell says you can use the analogy that other people behave in a way similar to you, so their mind must be analogous to your own, but there's no definitive way of disproving solipsism. Another concept is paradox, which is an absurd conclusion that seems to result from perfectly acceptable ways of thinking. And the interesting example the book gives, and philosophers love these sort of paradoxes, are Epimenides the Cretan. So he is a Cretan saying all Cretans are liars. So if he's a liar because he's a Cretan, then all Cretans are not liars, but what he's saying is a lie, so it's sort of a trap. So that's an example of a paradox. So the next few slides, we're going to be focusing on logic, and the book gave an introduction to logic. So a logical argument, or an argument in general, is a verbal or written attempt to get other people to accept a belief or opinion by providing reasons why they should accept it. And arguments rely on 2 arenas of persuasion. And one is logic, which is more fixed, and that is it concerns those reasons that that should hold for anyone, anywhere, without appealing to personal feelings, sympathies, or prejudices. So logic is sort of a universal form of reasoning. And fallacies are logical errors, specifically when you make a logical error moving from premises to conclusions. And rhetoric involves personal appeals, personal charm, jokes, pleas, playing off sympathies or fears, basically everything other than logic that you can think of as a way of trying to persuade someone. So logic and rhetoric are usually combined in different configurations when someone's making an argument. And when you write your persuasive paper for this class, you have to think about to what extent your argument is based on a logical argument with premises and conclusions and explaining how you're moving through them, or to what extent it's based on rhetoric, where you're just trying to appeal to sympathies and emotion. So some 2 major forms of logical argument are deductive arguments, which reason from one statement to another by means of accepted logical rules. So anyone who accepts the premises is bound logically to accept the conclusion, and I'll show you what premises are and what a conclusion is. And inductive arguments infer one statement from another, but it is possible for the conclusion to be false, even if all the premises are true. And an example of this would be that generalization is a form of inductive reasoning, where you take a particular set of observations, and based on those observations, you make a general statement about what you've observed that may or may not be true in every instance, but based on what you've observed is true. Validity. So a deductive argument is valid when it correctly conforms to the rules of deduction, when it is impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. So an example is it was either A or B. That is a premise. It wasn't A. That is the other premise. Therefore, that is the conclusion. It was B. So the initial statements are the premises and they precede the conclusion. And because this was a deductive argument with specifically two premises and a conclusion, this form of a logical argument is known as a syllogism. And putting deductive arguments in the form of carefully diagrammed premises and conclusions, those are known as logical proofs. That's known as a proof. Soundness is different than validity. It's broader than validity. So it concerns the truth of the premises and the validity of the argument. So an example we have from the book of a valid argument, it's valid, the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises, but of questionable soundness, where the truth of the premises is questioned, is this argument. If someone wants socialized medicine, then he or she is a communist. Communists want to kill people. Therefore, if someone is for socialized medicine, he or she wants to kill people. So this is an example of an argument where if you mapped it out, if A, then B, if B, then C, therefore A, then C. So it's valid. However, it's not necessarily the case that someone that wants socialized medicine is a communist, and it's not necessarily the case that communists want to kill people. So the two premises, the truth of them are questioned. And it's important to note that a deductive argument cannot prove its own premises. So typically when you're given an argument, a deductive argument, and you want to disagree with it, you need to prove that the premises are unsound. So soundness, a proof or an argument is sound if the premises are true and the argument is valid, which means, again, validity means the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. So now we'll move on to inductive arguments. So it's important to note that in deduction, the conclusion never states more than the premises. But in induction, the conclusion always states more than the premises. So the most typical inductive argument is that every A we have observed is a B, therefore every A is a B. And this is what we're kind of doing with a lot of scientific reasoning. We just make observations and draw conclusions from those observations, and the tentative conclusion is called a hypothesis. And what you do then is you look for counterexamples to strengthen your hypothesis. And if you don't encounter counterexamples, then your hypothesis is strengthened. But if you do, a counterexample is a new piece of evidence that can overturn a hypothesis. So the most common form of weak induction is generalization based on too few examples, when your pool of observation has not been large enough. Another feature of inductive reasoning is that context always matters. Background conditions and the state of knowledge at the moment are always in some sense presupposed. And you have to be careful that you don't come up with a self-confirming hypothesis which creates its own confirmation or alternatively blocks all possible counterexamples from the start. So the book gives an interesting example of the paranoid who thinks they are all out to get me. So he or she then systematically interprets all other people's behavior in a hostile way, but then is also feeding this by behaving in such a way that people really do become wary of him or her. Another form of inductive argument is argument by analogy. And it's important to note that when you're using analogous reasoning, no two things are similar in every respect, or they would be the same thing. So to be careful that you're not comparing apples and oranges is the typical saying. But if you do engage or encounter an argument by analogy, you must ask, are the things compared similar, And more specifically, are the things similar in the relevant respects in question? Those are the two things to ask. Another feature of argument that you must be aware of is necessary and sufficient conditions. So a definition supposedly supplies necessary and sufficient conditions. That's how you define something. Thus, a way of challenging a philosophical definition or theory put forward is to show that it is logically possible to have A without B if the person is defining B as a defining aspect of A, or B without A. The mere logical possibility of a counterexample suffices to challenge a definition, because a definition proffers logically necessary and sufficient conditions that cover all possible cases. So the first bullet point is dealing with the necessary aspect, and the second is sort of dealing with the sufficient. Like, it's sufficient if you can come up with one counterexample. Reductio ad absurdum is a form of deductive argument that is indirect. It involves taking an opponent's view and demonstrating how that view has intolerable or contradictory consequences. So one example of defeating solipsism, this isn't like a direct deductive argument, is that if you can't know other minds exist, then you can't know you exist. And the impossibility of self-knowledge is absurd because, as Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. So that's one indirect but deductive way of taking on solipsism, but there are problems with that, of course. So common fallacies. So fallacies, again, are logical errors where the conclusion does not necessarily follow from the premises. So mere assertion is a common fallacy that we all commit by ourselves on our own, which is the fact that we accept a position is not sufficient for anyone else to believe it. So mere assertion is when you sort of think, because you think it, other people must think it, or just stating our view is an argument for it when that is not the case. Begging the question involves accepting as a premise what is supposed to be argued for as a conclusion. So the book gives us the example of, you should be a Christian because the Bible tells you so. Well, thinking the Bible is a reliable guide for how to live and what to believe, that needs to be argued for. That needs to be a conclusion, not a premise. And a vicious cycle or circle is if you argue A because of B and B because of C, but then C because of A. So you assume what you want to prove. So an example using the Bible again would be that you should believe the Bible is the Word of God because the Bible says it's the Word of God. So you're assuming what you want to prove. Common fallacies continued include ad hominem arguments, which means attacking an opponent personally instead of arguing against his or her position. We see politicians do this all the time when they attack each other's character or each other personally instead of attacking their political views. Pseudo questions or false questions are when the fallacious reasoning begins with the very question being asked. They're questions based on some hidden piece of nonsense. Dubious authority, which is again that expertise in one field does not always transfer to another. So someone that is a great economist might not be a great cosmologist. A slippery slope argument. Now this is confusing because sometimes slippery slope arguments are not fallacious, but often they are. And this involves attacking the question of, does attacking extreme instances attack a whole institution? And the book gives a free speech example where if we, a slippery slope argument that you often encounter is if we censor free speech at all, free speech as an institution will completely fall apart. And so again, sometimes it's true that if you start on a path, there's some inevitability, but more often than not, slippery slope arguments fallaciously argue inevitability where it is not. So another one I can think of is there's a right to die movement in the United States that is trying to legalize federally physician-assisted suicide and voluntary euthanasia. And one of the most common arguments against it is that if we legalize physician-assisted suicide and voluntary euthanasia, involuntary euthanasia will become legal. So that's an example of a slippery slope argument that seems pretty dubious. Finally, attacking a straw man. So this is attack, or a woman is attacking an unreal opponent with easily refutable arguments and objections. So this kind of happens sometimes in gun rights individuals that claim that most people that are arguing for sensible gun laws are really arguing that no one should have access to guns of any sort. And that's kind of a straw man argument. That's not really what people are saying when they're saying that there should be sensible gun laws. They're looking for background checks and maybe banning assault rifles is as far as that goes. So our chapter 1 question is define logic, validity, soundness, and fallacy, and give an example of a common fallacy. So I'm not going to do this for you. The PowerPoint is available on Canvas. So you can look at the PowerPoint yourself to make sure that you have all these definitions. But it'd be important to know that fallacy is not just, to be able to explain that fallacy is not just a logical error. It's specifically an error where the conclusion does not necessarily follow from the premises. You need to be able to articulate that. So make sure you write that down in case you were to encounter this question on a study guide or an exam.